I'm Tim Monroe, and this is what I really want to talk about. There's something fascinating about every single one of us. Everybody has a passion and a story to tell, something that lights them up. Every week I sit down with interesting people and we talk about the things that really matter to them and to all of us. It might be funny, it might be weighty, it might be weird. It's what I really want to talk about. My guest today is the Reverend Kent Gilbert. Pastor Kent is an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ and since 1997 has served as pastor and teacher to Union Church here in Berea, Kentucky. When he was called, he was the youngest pastor called in the church's history, only 32 years old, and now has become the second longest to serve, exceeded only by the founding pastor, John G. Fee, also the founder of Berea College, who served for 41 years. Kent is a native of Denver, Colorado, and graduated from Whittier College, Whittier, California in 1987 with a BA in Religion and Culture. In seminary, he was educated at the University of Chicago Divinity School and at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. Before moving to Berea, he served parishes in Chicago and Idaho as a student and took his first called position at Ingle Chapel United Church of Christ in Milton, Freewater, Oregon. Reverend Kent also has a deep love of music, dance, artistic expression, and community, and they remain strong metaphors for his sense of partnership and harmony within the work of Christ, including the ways we speak truth to power and tend to our wounds. He currently serves as chair of the Justice and Advocacy Commission of the Kentucky Council of Churches and the Board of Madison County International Committee, the body that administers the 3-decade relationship between Madison County, Kentucky, and Hokuto City, Japan. Kent is married to the Reverend Deanna Holtgren, oncology chaplain for the Markey Cancer Center at the University of Kentucky Medical Center in Lexington. Together they have one giant dog and some cats too, I think?
Two cats.
Two cats. Welcome, Kent Gilbert. What do you really want to talk about today?
I want to talk about the ways in which ancient traditions become new and weird. And that means I want to talk about sumo wrestling.
Sumo wrestling.
Sumo wrestling.
When I asked you prior to this what you really wanted to talk about, I was the most surprised at your answer that I've been at anybody else who I've interviewed. So this is going to be a ton of fun. Before we grapple with sumo wrestling, maybe just let's spend a couple minutes just talking about your current work at Union Church and sort of your role there and what that means to you.
I came to Union Church well before I was ever hired. As a teenager, I came to Berea, Kentucky, pursuing my family's general culture of dance and music. And of course, Berea College has hosted so many wonderful events, but I came to it through the country dancers, through the traditional music festival, things like that. And so from the time I was 17, I had this sort of auxiliary connection to Berea, and then in 1997 was hired as pastor, which I thought was going to be probably 2 years before they figured out that I was not nearly the right person and would be, summarily sent on to the next pastorate. Instead, it's really been a place of just really a great place to grow and deepen. You can't stay anywhere this long and thrive without being fed yourself.
Right.
And I've been really, really lucky to have such a great place.
Great. And you're such a important part of this community and so enmeshed in this community in so many ways. So it's really good to be talking to you today. So, sumo wrestling.
Right. So what I knew of sumo wrestling pretty much my entire life, well through my adult years, was that you could get a giant inflatable suit and see college students throwing themselves at each other on beaches or at bars. That's all I knew. Is a bunch of fat guys who threw each other big roundhouse punches and tried to knock each other with their bellies. I, as you mentioned, became very involved with the sister city relationship. And that didn't really involve much sumo, but it did get me in contact with Japan. And prior to the pandemic, just about 5 years ago, I was, I think, ill at home. This was before the pandemic. And I just had one of those notions, I've made a joke of this my entire life. I've never actually seen the real thing. I wonder if I could. Well, of course, the internet is full of the ability to see anything you want. And so there were sumo matches, and I found myself rather surprisingly intrigued.
So was this the sort of first time you actually saw a sumo match or thought maybe this is kind of an interesting thing?
First time was it's sort of a random YouTube, Google excursion.
Yeah. So And for those of you who don't know Kent Gilbert, he is maybe the direct opposite physically of what you think about when you visualize a sumo wrestler. He's pretty much the diametric opposition to that body type. So it's very interesting. So tell us a little bit. I know very little about sumo. I did some light research for this interview, but I know very little about it other than these large men smacking into each other.
Right.
So describe a sumo match. Like, what's the object? What are the rules?
Yeah, it's very simple, and that's, I think, maybe one of the appeals to me is that this is not a complicated sport. It is nothing compared to, like, I have friends who are into baseball, and you're one of them, who can quote ERAs and all kinds of things, and and statistics and remember games from 35 years ago. Yeah. I have the reputation in my family as being not only the least like a sumo wrestler, but also the least sports person.
Right.
That's just not where my head's been.
Yeah.
And it's been something of a surprise to discover this particular passion. But here's what's interesting about a sumo match is that there's a ring. It's about 15 feet. It's 4.33 meters across.
Okay.
And it's in dirt.
It's a circle.
It's a circle.
Okay.
And the object is to push your opponent out of the circle or to get any part except the soles of their feet to touch the clay.
Okay.
So if you fall and you put your hand down, if you land on your back or however, anything but the soles of your feet touch, then you lose.
And that's it.
And that's it.
It's not like 2 out of 3 or something.
No.
It's like,
no,
boom, you're out.
No.
Okay.
And in the sumo match, the way they're very short.
Yeah.
This is another thing
Right.
that's sort of maybe good for my short attention span, which is that the average sumo match lasts 8 to 10 seconds, maybe.
Wow.
And the longest match, I read somewhere that the longest match lasted all of 32 minutes, but it was years and years ago.
32 minutes.
Yeah.
Wow.
But now the vast majority lasts 10, 15 seconds,
Right.
maybe.
So are there things, in terms of the actual combat or whatever, the physical sort of coming together of these two athletes, are there rules? Are there certain things you can and can't do?
Yeah. You can't use a closed fist.
Okay.
You can't pull on anybody's hair.
Okay.
You can't gouge eyes or any sensitive parts
Right.
Below the waist.
Right.
You cannot kick, although you can sweep the leg.
Okay.
So you can sweep legs, but you can't make a direct punch or kick at anybody.
Okay.
And in this way, it's sort of an interesting, it has an interesting civility to it,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I find at great odds with the fact that you have very massive men throwing themselves at each other. These
Right.
folks weigh 175 kilos. That's
300 something.
350, 400
Yeah.
pounds.
Yeah. Which for a Japanese person is extraordinary.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, it's not just Japanese who compete. In fact, the Mongolians have been sort of the dominant force in recent years. There's great excitement in the sumo world because just this last month, the first Japanese Yokozuna, that's the highest ranked wrestler that achieving the highest rank, was promoted and was a Japanese native, and that was a big deal. So in the ring, what you have is both the contestants. There's nobody who starts them. They have to agree to start together. They do that by putting both fists on the clay. Okay. You face your opponent across a small, about a yard apart,
Right.
and they put their fists down. And when they do, then they launch at each other.
Right.
And there's different styles.
Yeah.
People who've watched and probably just from pastiches and cartoons know that sumo wrestlers wear this funny kind of. It's called a mawashi, but it's it's actually 30 meters long of hand-woven silk, which is very strong. That's one of the reasons they do it.
Yeah.
But it's wrapped several times
Yeah.
in kind of a diaper-like way.
Yeah.
Some wrestlers like to grab a hold of that mawashi, and it gives them leverage.
So they can grab.
They
that.
can grab.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And some wrestlers have a style that's called pusher-thruster, and that means that they're literally doing just that. They're pushing and thrusting and slapping.
Right.
Slapping is okay with an open palm.
Right.
You can't close your fist.
Right.
But people slap, they grab throats, they can push by leaning on armpits. And then there's the leg kicks.
Yeah.
So it can be very fast. But what's interesting is that it's Japanese, right? So it is surrounded by an incredible amount of protocol and culture, even these short matches. And that's, I guess, what I wanted to talk about, which is this sort of preservation of a wider culture in this wildly different act. I mean, as you've been to Japan, I think.
Yeah, just recently, yeah.
And so the Japanese have got to be among the most polite people I've ever encountered.
Unbelievable. So before we get too deep into the cultural stuff, because that's really, I think, where maybe the meat of this conversation is going to be, I want to talk a little bit, just briefly more about the actual matches and strategy itself.
Sure.
So I watched a couple videos in preparation for this, and you mentioned how they put their fists on the ground and face each other, which is very much looks like an offensive lineman and a defensive lineman in a football game looking at each other across the line of scrimmage. It's very similar. And in football, and this is true in wrestling, it's all about leverage, right? And so I think, is the strategy to... Well, I think what they would tell you in football is if you're an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman, you want to be the low one. Right. You want to get lower than the other person. Is that the sort of
very
strategy?
Similar. Yeah. Well, I've listened to a lot of commentary, and of course, my knowledge is as an outsider, and I'm just a gaijin fan, the foreigner who watching from a distance. But I've found myself very interested in any physics major would find sumo wrestling a fascinating study in biomechanics because you're right. There are no weight classes in sumo.
Yeah.
So you don't wrestle people of your same size at all. And the weights vary wildly. In the top professional division, the lightest wrestler is outweighed by more than 150 pounds. That means that you've got comparatively little guys facing off against these mountains. But it's quite often that the little guy wins because lower down gives you more options for leverage. It's easier for those guys to be slightly faster, and maybe they can get a sweep of the leg, or maybe they can push upwards. You get a big person off balance and top heavy. Well, that helps you get them out of the ring.
So it's not just size. It's also like in football. I mean, size matters, right? It's good to be big and strong, but it's also there's technique there that can sometimes win the day.
And I think that's what hooked me.
Yeah,
is that it isn't just two really super fat guys crashing into each other like it is on beaches or bars in our sort of inflato suits. It really is about this incredible strength training. So while they weigh a lot, but the muscle they practice pushing truck tires up hills. They have to practice getting low and finding those leverage points and figuring out their own balance. I know one of the exercises that sumo wrestlers do is it's very important that they have strength in their toes, not something that most people exercise, but your ability to grab and leverage just from a big toe might be what gives you the pivot you need to throw a person or to execute a thrust out of the ring.
And so, have you actually been in person to a sumo tournament?
I just had that opportunity in February, so yes, it was excellent. Very exciting.
So, what is that like? What is a sumo tournament? What was the experience like?
Yeah, it's very much like a baseball game. In fact, it's a square, right? So the ring is in the middle. And then all the seats are set up in a square around it. So there's east side and west side, north side and south side.
Similar to a boxing match.
Very similar. Yeah, very similar that way. And set up the same way. The platform, the ring is raised a little bit so that and then the seats fan out upwards. And some people like to sit right close so they can feel the sweat and get fallen on. And these guys get pushed out of the ring, and I always fear for the lives of both the judges and the people who sit, the spectators.
And there's no ropes or
anything. No.
Right? Yeah.
There's no bounding. Yeah. So it is not at all uncommon for a 500-pound wrestler to come flying out of the ring and land on
somebody.
I've never seen them carted away, but I always made sure when we got tickets that we were further back from the ring. No, so it's very has a great atmosphere. There's they're outside in the stadium. It's an enclosed place, but they got just what you'd have in an American place. They have beer and burgers and it's sushi and sake, sushi and beer and sake, and but you have then places to sit. And there's cheap seats up in the high bets, and closer down is, of course, more expensive.
And at a sumo tournament, do you get to the end of the day and there's one winner, or is it just lots of matches that are not necessarily related?
Right. No, a tournament is 15 days long, and
wow.
each wrestler wrestles just once on each of those 15 days.
Okay.
A tournament is decided at the end of those 15 days with the person who's won the most matches.
Okay.
But it's very important for all of the wrestlers to what their record is.
Right.
It being Japanese, like I say, it inculcates a lot of culture. And
Yeah.
of course, Japanese, polite culture is also very hierarchical culture.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say at this point that sumo is among the oldest known continuously practiced sports in human history. Sumo has essentially been practiced in exactly the same way for 1,500 years.
Wow.
Our oldest sport in America probably is some form of baseball or basketball. Football comes in a little bit later. We can find antecedents and things like cricket, and nothing goes back 1,500 years.
Right.
So when you have this sort of this tournament, the rankings have a lot to do. Your ranking is determined by how many wins and losses in a given tournament. So if you might be ranked as wrestler number 17 in the regular ranks, but if you have more wins than losses, then you're going to go up, and maybe you're going to be wrestler ranked number 5.
Right.
That has importance based on who your matches are going to be with each time, and also how much money you earn.
Right.
So higher ranked.
So it's not like a bracket where you win and then you win and then you win. So you just keep wrestling.
Right.
Okay. And at the end, whoever had the most victories is the winner.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how did you feel there? Did you feel like an intensity? Was the crowd really into it? How did you feel there?
Yeah, the crowd was into it, and we were there on a day where they were doing it was a special set of wrestling it was a benefit for disabled children, and so this was not a regular tournament, but it was a single day of wrestling, so it was exactly like going to a match, with the exception that one side of it they had closed off to make sort of a broadcast studio, and they had other events. But the wrestling itself was a full regulation wrestling. That is to say, all 40-some of the top wrestlers competed in matches. They all wrestled at once, so there were about 20 matches per day. And as I said, I was curious to see what the preparations would be like, because when you watch on American TV, what you will get is sort of a highlights reel. Every match is shown in completion, but they're only 10 seconds long.
10 seconds long, yeah.
What you don't get to see is sort of that culture and that ritual. And so that was what really interested me.
Yeah.
And things that stood out. So when two opponents enter the ring, there's also a referee who's called a gyoji, but a referee who doesn't start the match, but who is charged with calling it. In other words, this one stepped out, this one stepped out, this one fell, you win, you win. Right. All three of them enter the ring, but entering the ring, because it has this long history that's rooted in Shinto religious practice, right? These were games for the gods, just as Roman games were games in honor of the gods back in ancient Rome. So the wrestlers sort of prepare themselves in special ways. So they stand on the side outside the ring, and they'll sip special water. They sip water if and only if the guy coming in on that side won before them. Because then they believe that there's sort of this idea that that's lucky water. Then, right. So they have the sip of water. But before either one of them enters the ring, they'll throw salt.
Okay.
In a sumo match, they will go through a single day. They'll use 150 to 200 kilos of salt. Because they'll throw this into the ring onto the clay.
Is there a purpose to the salt, or is it just like a ritual thing?
It's a ritual thing. The purpose originally, as I understand it, comes from purification, right? This was a Shinto purification.
Okay.
So you're entering holy space, and you throw the salt to sort of clear the way. And then people have often commented they see the sumo wrestlers patting their stomachs in this big dramatic fashion. That's really just shaking the salt off their hands. But they've turned it into this sort of, posturing, this big monster, and they're putting on their game face, very impassive.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that's when you can show your game face, but then you're supposed to be super impassive as soon as you enter the ring. And you'll see this. The guys practice not smiling, not showing pain, not grimacing. They don't shake their heads. They don't swear. They don't spike the ball. It's very very Japanese and the sort of very reserved, and you bow to each other. You then clash, you clobber, and you tear, and you throw, and you thrust, and people crash down. And then, no, the loser doesn't get to leave the ring until once again everybody takes their place and bows to each other again.
Okay.
At which point the referee will then award that person, the loser will leave, and the winner will kneel down and receive any prize money that's handed out for that.
Right, and I assume there's no celebration dance
Oh,
by the winner at the end.
absolutely
That would be
not.
not cool.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know this. I'm not sure, but are there who are the current stars in the sumo world? Do you follow enough to know that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the latest and greatest, as I mentioned, the newly promoted yokozuna. Yokozunas are the only rank that don't become demoted.
Okay.
So everybody else rises and falls every tournament, right? Mm-hmm. So you can be promoted all the way up and then fall all the way down, depending on your wrestling record. But once you are promoted to yokozuna, you never are demoted. But you're expected to win.
Right.
So if you stop winning, you're expected now to resign.
Okay.
But the latest and greatest is a guy named Onosato. Okay. Every wrestler takes a special name. Sometimes it's just their name, their last name. Sometimes it means something. There's a famous second tier down is an ozeki, and a very famous ozeki from previous years, maybe 40 years ago, turns out to be this man's grandfather.
Okay.
And when he was promoted, he had a different name. When he was promoted to ozeki, he took the name Katozakura, in honor of the same one as his grandfather had.
Yeah.
But Onosato is the latest and greatest yokozuna. He was just promoted here in May.
Yeah.
And very exciting because sumo has become less popular with younger Japanese.
Yeah.
And they've been on a campaign to try and continue to increase knowledge of it. And there's a lot of feeling that having a Japanese yokozuna rather than Mongolians, the previous two have been Mongolian.
Okay.
It will make a difference there.
Well, and it's, like you mentioned, I was in Japan just this past February, and I know you've been there several times. And, it's really true. You walk around the streets of Tokyo or wherever, there are no fat people anywhere. They're all, relatively small, seem like they're in good shape. It's very rare to see an overweight person in Japan. Very different than here in the States. And just so the fact that this is the national sport is kind of unbelievable. I mean, I guess it's this idea of aspiring to be this sort of larger than life kind of person.
That's it. Yeah. It's sort of that superhero.
Yeah.
And it stands out, right?
Yeah.
It's unusual.
Right. Yeah. And I guess like all those sports, you're talking about how old it is, and maybe this is a good segue to talk about some of the cultural issues. But boxing is probably, or wrestling is probably the most analogous one-on-one.
Absolutely.
And that's not a team sport; it's an individual sport. It's one person against another person in sort of literal combat, right? I mean, it's regulated and structured, and there are rules, but it is literal hand-to-hand combat. And so, how did that develop in Japan from the beginnings until, sort of what it is now?
Yeah, I suspect it was much like we find Greco-Roman wrestling, in that it was a necessary skill on a certain level. Certainly, if you go back far enough, we're talking about skills that would protect your clan, your tribe, your village. And so, obviously, practice was helpful, same with Greek warriors and Roman soldiers. And that turned into contests, just as firemen today do climb buildings that have contests in this way. I'm sure it originated something like that, and these festivals provided opportunity to say, who's best in our village? All right, well, let's put our guest guy against your village guy.
Right. And you see this in fiction a lot, and so especially like fantasy kinds of things where there'll be, in order to avoid a larger conflict, you'll have one side as a champion, another side as a champion, and whoever wins, they win instead of thousands of people dying, which sounds like a good alternative.
Yeah, and I think that's very Japanese too.
Yes.
Now, it's not the Japanese reality. The Japanese had certainly had mass battles and things, but the idea of a person representing the whole, and that contest being brought down to a small space and celebrating, and deciding things is very much a part of the culture widely, and certainly a part of sumo.
Right, and I wonder because the other sort of militaristic ritual that a lot of people associate with in Japan is the samurai culture. And there was just recently that miniseries Shogun, which is very popular, which is sort of showed the samurai culture. And I wonder if there are sort of connections, between sumo and samurai.
A great number, actually. Sumo wrestling becomes an extremely popular sport during the samurai period. This is a time when Japan finally exits a period of lots of war and lots of tribal warfare, and are unified as a nation. What that does is, in peacetime, you've got a lot of warriors with less to do. Mm-hmm. And they also ended up with a relatively prosperous era here at the same time. So you have both money for leisure activities, and you have a bunch of warrior class that needs some kind of warrior activity.
Yeah.
And so both directly and indirectly, samurai became sumo wrestlers or did sumo wrestling, but they also became patrons and sponsored sumo schools, sumo trainers, put up them prize monies. So the samurai, even today, are represented in a certain way because the hairstyles, sumo wrestlers have a special hairstyle that is a hairstyle that was only allowed for samurai in about the 17th century. Yeah. So their hairstyle harkens back to that. The costume of the gyojis is much more akin to what you might have seen in the samurai period. The goji, by the way, the referee, has the best referee costume of any sport on the planet, period.
Not black and white stripes.
Not black and white stripes. That wears a full male kimono that is 100% silk, often given by winning wrestlers as a prize or a present to each of these gyojis. You have to go through years of training to do this, and the head gyoji carries a short samurai dagger as a symbol of his willingness to commit seppuku if he judges wrongly.
Oh my gosh!
Right now, thank God no one has ever done that, at least in living memory. But he carries this dagger as a samurai. It's a samurai value, right? Like honor and dignity are these huge deals, and this guy carries a ceremonial dagger to indicate that if he judges poorly or inaccurately, he is willing to take his own life over the matter.
Right. So I'm also thinking, if sumo were really popular in America, it would be so ripe for gambling. Is that part of the culture of sumo?
110%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, sumo has had many periods. Most recently in 2008, 2009, there's a huge scandal that was revealed about match fixing. There was a system by which head trainers, they're called okata, would trade matches. Like, my guy needs to win. I need to get his rankings up. So you're going to throw the match for me, this one, and then I'll throw one for you later. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah. And that corruption scandal, it rocked the sumo world, and it really has always had connections with underworld.
Yeah.
Kind of like boxing here with the mafia, the Yakuza, which is the Japanese kind of mafia-style organized crime, in as much as that's Japan has them. The Yakuza have often run those gambling rackets. So, there's always that danger. And it's big money, just like here.
And there's lots of examples of scandals in American sports history, and often involving organized crime. The one people often think about is the 1919 Black Sox, Chicago White Sox. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not Shoeless Joe Jackson actually did throw the series, because he actually played really well.
Right.
So it's still a controversy. But and there's, of course, Pete Rose, who's the exemplar right now of having gambled on his own sport, and then lied about it for many years. And now they're thinking about
how to restore
putting him back into the Hall of Fame,
restore
maybe.
His reputation if needed.
Yeah. So the cultural issues and the ritual of it. So having been in Japan, and I'm no expert on Japan. I just was there for the first time ever, and I really loved my visit. But you can see this sense of politeness, especially a sense of reserve. Not that people aren't friendly, but it's not like going to Italy where, like, they'll hug you and kiss you and welcome you. But they're hospitable, but in a more reserved kind of way. And sumo seems like this, much more. Well, I'm looking for a good word that would describe it, like sort of expressive and a little bit outlandish. And even though they follow these rituals, it is this sort of big, grand spectacle, which seems a little bit, in contrast to the rest of Japanese culture.
I think I've described to others my experience of Japan, too, that along those lines, that Japan is full of these contrasts.
Yeah.
Right? The same culture that invented, or should I say cherished, right, these incredibly lengthy arts and crafts traditions that took 50, 60, 70 years to master, and you teach to one other student who would apprentice for 40 years before they'd be allowed to, make one thing. And if you watched Jiro Dreams of Sushi, a great Netflix documentary about sushi, one of his one of the chef's apprentices talks about how he had to make 10,000 batches of tamago, the little egg dish. It's basically scrambled eggs in a pan. He had to make 10,000 before he was allowed to serve it to a customer.
That's amazing.
So that's that.
Yeah.
But on the other side, Japan is also the culture that looked across the pond, saw what Henry Ford was doing, refined it, perfected it, and can manufacture 100 million tiny plastic sushi plates in an hour. Right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing in between.
Right.
There's either handcrafted, it costs $4 million and it takes 40 years, or I've made you 10 million of them for 4 cents each.
Well, they also sort of took the car and perfected it in some ways. Like, in the 80s and 90s, people were like, well, the Japanese cars are just better, even though it's an American invention. They kind of were able to sort of take it to the next level. And I think that's true of a lot of things in Japan, electronics, that sort of thing. The other thing I was thinking about is, sort of prior to World War II, right? Japan was this sort of, I think, fractured, relatively militaristic society, and had this, the samurai tradition and the tradition of warriors and sort of an aggressive, in a sense, an aggressive imperialist culture. That all changed, honestly, when the bombs dropped in Japan. And now sumo seems to be almost like a hearkening back to that time. That's something that's sort of a thread that goes back to that time, maybe. Or maybe I'm just, thinking too hard about it.
No, I don't think so. I think that Japan is a country of intention and intensity, right? I think that explains some of the contrast between, what you described prior and with the cars, right? Whatever they decide, there's a lot of intention can go into it, and then a lot of intensity can be applied to it. That's what's true of their militarism as well as their other cultural aspects. And when they began their imperial domination, as they came out of this feudal society in the 1860s, they mechanized very quickly, much more quickly than any other Asian country. They learned what the West had brought them. They took it on and said, hey, I know what we can do with this. And because they did have this militaristic thread, I would say that sumo represents a thread that didn't connect back to that, but actually ran through it from prior times, right?
Sure.
And that same intensity shows up in all of the political movements that Japan has had, including when they relinquished their militarism, right? There's a very famous story about MacArthur, who has accepted the resignation of the head general on the ship, and lands for the first time at Yokohama Air Force Base, where all of the Japanese troops in the Tokyo area have been mustered. We're talking about 50 or 60,000 standing at formation, carrying their weapons with bayonets attached.
Yeah.
And he lands to basically proclaim American occupation and military law.
Right.
He lands the plane, and he's about to open it. It's a DC-3. He's about to step down onto the tarmac, and his Marine guard says, there is no way you are going out there. There are 50,000 armed combatants out there.
Yeah.
And he says, you completely do not understand the character
Yeah.
of of the people we are working with here.
Right.
And he stepped out there and he said, "The emperor has surrendered. The war is over. Lay down your weapons and go home." And 50,000 men laid down their guns and walked away.
Yeah.
Because in defeat, it was total. Victory was going to be total. Defeat was going to be total. And again, not as much middle ground there.
Right.
And of course, the war had been very, very hard on the Japanese people. They starved their own people. This is the dark side that I think an American imperialism needs to pay attention to. It comes at an incredible cost to those who have to keep it up.
Right.
And in supporting the military, the imperial movement starved the people of Japan in order to keep the war machine rolling.
Yeah. So this ancient sport, sumo, which, as you said, may be the most ancient, continuously practiced sport. I mean, two guys have been fighting each other since the dawn of time, right? Cain and Abel and whoever else. But what do you think is the future of sumo? In this country, they talk about, that baseball may be dying because it's a slower sport. Not as many younger people want to pay attention to it. And they've tried to make some rule changes to make the game a little more fast-paced and that kind of thing. And it's still relatively popular. But, sports like basketball and football and increasingly soccer are becoming more and more popular. So is there a future for sumo in Japan, or do you think it's going to sort of,
From what I see, I think there is a future for it. I also think that anything that's lasted 1,500 years is not necessarily endangered from a momentary lapse.
Right.
Even of a momentary, we mean 3 or 4 generation lapse in interest. I think it will probably continue. But I also think that it has some interesting popularity around the world. As I mentioned before, there are Mongolian traditions. Ukraine is supplying a great number of top wrestlers. Right? There are 2 Ukrainian wrestlers now in the top division. And
are they welcomed in that community?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
They certainly are welcomed as wrestlers.
Yeah, okay.
But I don't know.
They can win, right? I mean, I just, Japan is, like I would comment with people, like, what was it like going to Japan? And my first answer, I loved it. It was great. It was beautiful. The people were great. The food was amazing, blah, blah, blah. But there's also this sense that everyone in Japan is Japanese.
Yeah.
There isn't large immigrant communities. There aren't minority communities in Japan. And while they welcome you as a visitor, not sure they'd be happy if you move next door.
It can be a very regimented, very hierarchical, and sometimes a pretty unfriendly place for foreigners.
Yeah,
it can be. I think that there's a recent scandal that just broke a few weeks ago about all wrestlers belong to what we might call a club, a wrestling club, where they live and train together. Once you join that, it's like a family. You don't transfer between them, except in very rare cases. One of those clubs was run by a very famous wrestler who looked the other way when there was some bullying in that club, and it ended up, actually, there was a case of suicide where the bullying got so bad that one of the wrestlers took his own life. This caused a great scandal, although amidst all the pearl clutching, there was also the tacit acknowledgement that was not that unusual. What was kind of the way we might think about frat
hazing, right?
Yeah, everybody sort of knows it happens, but until somebody gets really hurt or arrested,
people don't really pay attention. Yeah,
and I think there is that danger in that kind of society, and for foreign wrestlers. But as for the future, one of the things that I think is potentially interesting is that clubs are multiplying in other countries around the world.
Okay,
there was a movement. It didn't happen. There was a movement. I can't remember why, but sumo was scheduled to be an Olympics demonstration sport, with the hope that it might be added as a wrestling sport in the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
There are now, interestingly, a growth of women's sumo.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is new for Japan, and not without its own controversies.
Sure.
This is as I say, this comes from this very traditionalist society, right? So, it is forbidden for women to step foot inside that ring where they wrestle, usually, right? It's this, again, without commenting on that.
Right.
That's a whole other
Yeah.
topic of.
That's another hour.
That's another hour of that sort of thing. But because of that, it was not seen as the purview of women. But over the last, I would say, 15 years, women's sumo has become a thing, particularly in high school and colleges.
Right.
And there has now been the beginnings of a league that is beginning to do national professional level women's wrestling. That is actually taking off in other countries as well. So I think what you see is there is interest, in part because of the very things we've talked about. It does take leverage. It is about strategy. It's not just about weight. Smaller, lighter people often win against heavier opponents. And you have this formality, tradition, and cultural continuance, this cultural thread that gives it I think sumo, if I could say, punches above its weight. Plus, it's fast. And in a tic-tac culture, a TikTok era, where really nobody has more than 30 seconds of concentration, sumo has a lot going for it.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking about, too, is that sumo, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but, in the sports world today, especially in the United States, it's now been so much of it has been overtaken by technology in that there's these analytics that are changing the way people play the game based on, so much data gathered saying, well, you need to do this every time because 7 times out of 10 it works, whereas before they were just doing it by instinct, right? And now they're being told to sort of follow these analytics, especially in baseball, but also basketball, football, all of those sports. And sumo seems kind of immune to that. I don't know. Maybe
that's
I'm
right.
wrong.
No, I think you may be right. I'm sure it's Japan.
Yeah.
So I am certain that somebody has 3D captured the sumo matches for the last 200 years and now is analyzing them with AI. I'm sure that's Japan.
And these techniques work more than these.
Or you've got to make this technique work, put your foot 1 millimeter to the right or left or up.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're right. I think the tradition here is very much that each one teach one. It's a mentorship. You come up through the ranks. The bad news about that is the hierarchy. The good news about that is you really do develop these lifelong friendships, and your skill is constantly nurtured from all the way up the funnel.
Yeah.
So I think that sumo does resist some of that, and what you need for this sport, you don't have advances in ball technology. We're not inventing a new way to throw somebody down. It's like a baseball bat when aluminum came in, remember, and all the controversy. You use ash wood or oak wood. You don't have that.
Yeah.
You have 2 practically naked opponents
Right.
who and a circle of dirt.
Right.
That's it.
Well, maybe they're applying technology to what they eat, to gain weight and all that stuff.
Right.
Yeah, but So anyway, Kent, I'm really thrilled that you came here to talk about sumo. Like I said, I was very surprised that this was the topic that you really wanted to talk about. But now not so surprised because sumo is very connected to ritual and culture, and I think the Shinto religion even. And so not that shocking that you are a sumo aficionado. But I really appreciate you coming today and spending some time and talking about sumo wrestling. So thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me come. It's been a pleasure.
What I Really Want to Talk About is produced and recorded in the studios of Berea College News and Radio in Berea, Kentucky. You can learn more about this podcast and listen to all of the previous episodes at whatIreallyWantToTalkAbout.com. My contact information is on the website, so please get in touch with me if there is something that you really want to talk about. I'm Tim Monroe. Thanks for listening.